Countless teams throughout history owe their success to a great leader, someone to formulate a brilliant plan, make tough decisions, and inspire their team to achieve victory. How do you become a leader like this? According to Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, the one thing that sets apart the best leaders is extreme ownership, the willingness to accept responsibility for every flaw or failure related to your mission, no matter whose fault it is. Only when you quit blaming others and looking for excuses will you do everything within your power to achieve victory. Willink and Babin are both former U.S. Navy SEALs who trained SEAL leaders and led teams of their own as officers during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Upon returning to the United States, Willink and Babin founded Echelon Front, a consulting firm dedicated to training leaders in the corporate world. By advising high-level executives in a wide range of industries, Willink and Babin gained even more expertise in what it takes to be a leader. However, Willink and Babin emphasize that extreme ownership isn't just for military officers or business executives. You could use extreme ownership to successfully lead your family or even just discipline yourself. Anyone can take advantage of these principles to achieve their personal goals and improve their relationships. Why extreme ownership? In the dichotomy of leadership, Willink and Babin's sequel to Extreme Ownership, the authors explain that some readers misunderstand the title Extreme Ownership. They assume that it means being an extreme leader. For example, forcing your team to be strictly disciplined about every minute detail or to perpetually maintain manic energy and momentum while accomplishing tasks. Willink and Babin assert that doing everything as extremely as possible is counterproductive. Instead, Willink and Babin use the word extreme to convey that you should embrace more responsibility than is logical, for things no one would expect you to take responsibility for, like the actions of others. This core message is arguably the part of the book that's most applicable to readers not in official leadership roles. Taking more responsibility than expected is a respectable move in virtually any context. The alternative, blaming other people, is rarely helpful. It impedes empathy, causes division, and often offends others. For example, Willink has stated that extreme ownership is a powerful tool to maintain a healthy marriage. When both partners refuse to blame one another, they're more likely to see themselves as a team and resolve conflicts without trying to win. First, we'll explore how extreme ownership leads a team to success. It enables rapid self-improvement and inspires those around you to take extreme ownership. Then, we'll explain what extreme ownership looks like in action, discussing Willink and Babin's specific rules for organizing a mission with the greatest chance of success. Extreme ownership enables continuous improvement. To achieve greatness, you must be constantly on the lookout for ways your team can improve. According to Willink and Babin, extreme ownership is the best way to do so. By taking responsibility for your mistakes and the mistakes of your teammates, you're choosing to see all mistakes as problems you need to solve, not as things to blame someone for. This empowers you to continuously improve yourself and your team. Let's explain this process in more detail. First, we'll explain how taking ownership of others' mistakes is necessary for improvement. Then, how admitting to your own mistakes is necessary for improvement. Finally, we'll clarify why taking ownership of your team's failures doesn't mean taking credit for its successes. Take ownership of others' mistakes. A great team is made up of great team members. Every person on your team needs to operate at peak performance for the best chance of accomplishing your mission. As a leader taking extreme ownership, it's your responsibility to make sure this happens. Maintain high standards by taking ownership of the mistakes of others. Whenever someone on your team does something wrong, ask what you can do to make sure it doesn't happen again, rather than blaming others for the error. Refusing to take responsibility for your team's mistakes prevents you from improving yourself and improving the team. Why is this the case? When you blame someone else, you're telling yourself that the only way the team can improve is for them to do better. You ignore all the things you could be doing to improve, thereby limiting your team's potential. In reality, there's always something you can do to prevent your team members' mistakes. For example, imagine you're in charge of a bank and your unmotivated team of tellers is driving away customers with their bad attitudes. To improve, You need to take responsibility for the situation rather than just blaming your team for being surly. You might instate new incentives that reward your tellers for treating their customers well or fire the teller with the worst attitude who may be bringing down the others. Willink and Babin note that it's important to fix every mistake your team makes because it's easy to let high standards slip. If a team member is doing a task poorly and you fail to correct them, that behavior becomes your team's new standard for success. Be diligent about taking ownership of your teammates' mistakes, or your team will slide into mediocrity over time. Short-form note. In Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, Richard Rumelt refers to this process of gradually lowering standards as entropy and argues that all teams and organizations eventually devolve into ineffective chaos unless they actively work to prevent it. This offers more mindful leaders like you a competitive advantage. Rival organizations that have been dominant for a long time become more likely to collapse as time goes on, giving you an opportunity to surpass them if you maintain high standards. Even if extreme ownership is unrealistic, it's empowering. Willink and Babin argue that there's always something you can do to prevent your team's mistakes, but some would argue that this extreme statement is unrealistic. There have to be some situations where there's truly nothing you could have done to prevent failure, right? Certainly, but this doesn't mean that you shouldn't practice extreme ownership. Entrepreneur Tom Bilyeu argues that even if a disaster was truly impossible to avoid, you should still believe you could have done something to prevent it. He uses an extreme example to illustrate this concept. Bilyeu states that, hypothetically, if his wife were killed by a crashing meteor while visiting her family, ostensibly a freak accident no one could have predicted or averted, he would still blame himself for the tragedy. He claims that he could have reached out to astronomical observatories and worked with them to predict the meteor and avert the disaster. You may argue that it would be ridiculous for anyone to spend time tracking meteors on the slim chance that one might fall undetected and hit their loved ones. If this really happened, everyone would agree there's nothing Bilyeu could have done. But the accuracy of this belief isn't the point. In his website's manifesto, Bilyeu clarifies that he chooses to believe anything that empowers him, even if it's probably a lie. He would claim that extreme ownership is worth believing purely because you're more likely to succeed if you tell yourself you have total control over your world than if you believe some events render you powerless. As Willink and Babin explain, this is because if you ever believe there's nothing you could have done, you stop looking for ways to improve yourself and the team. Take ownership of your mistakes. Willink and Babin explain that extreme ownership means taking responsibility not only for the failures of others but also for your own failures. This is particularly difficult for leaders, whose mistakes most often cause severe consequences that impact the entire team. However, once you admit that you, and no one else, are to blame, you can learn from your mistakes and ensure you don't make them again. Taking ownership of your mistakes requires conquering your ego. If you prioritize feeling proud of yourself and impressing others over your mission, you'll hide anything that makes you look bad. When you make mistakes, you'll look for excuses and blame your teammates, feeding your ego by refusing to admit to yourself and others that you aren't perfectly capable. However, if you never acknowledge that your flaws exist, you'll never be able to fix them, making the team more likely to fail. Willink and Babin suggest that the best way to control your ego is to refocus on the mission. Remind yourself that your goal is more important than your ego, and extreme ownership is the best way to achieve that goal. You'll be more willing to suffer through the pain of admitting your mistakes if you remember what you're sacrificing for. Conquer your ego by redefining success. In Ego is the Enemy, Ryan Holiday agrees with Willink and Babin that focusing on your greater mission will help you subdue your ego. However, he also claims that this isn't enough to fully negate ego's negative effects. If you focus solely on your team's mission, as Willink and Babin advise, you'll likely base your ego on the accomplishment of that mission and only feel proud when your team succeeds. Holiday would argue that, like self-centered ego, this is a discouraging, unhelpful form of ego that hurts your chance of victory. If you fail the mission, you'll feel like all your work was a waste and won't feel motivated to try again. Instead, for the greatest chance of victory, redefine success for yourself. Don't feel proud of your team's successes. Feel proud of the effort you put into the mission, regardless of its outcome. This is the only truly sustainable type of pride, since your effort is the only thing you can completely control. This way, even if you make a disastrous mistake that harms your team, you won't feel defeated. As long as you tried your best and made the best decision you could under the circumstances, you'll see it as a victory. Furthermore, since you won't see mistakes as something to feel ashamed of, you'll feel motivated to learn from them and bounce back from failure even more efficiently. Take ownership, but don't take credit. Willink and Babin offer a caveat to the principle of extreme ownership. Assume responsibility for your team's failures, but don't take credit for their successes. Instead, attribute every success to your team's good work, even if you personally contributed the most. Congratulating yourself may fuel your ego, but it won't get you any closer to victory. Taking credit for yourself reinforces to your team that success is something that individuals achieve for themselves. In contrast, passing credit to your team members teaches them that success belongs to the entire team, encouraging them to follow your example and prioritize the mission above their egos. Short-form note: passing down credit that may rightfully belong to you isn't just useful because it motivates others to do the same. It can also be a tool to get others to do what you want. People are more likely to take your advice if they get credit for its implementation, or if they feel they came up with the idea. By offering your ideas in a way that prevents you from taking credit, you can influence others to advance your mission for you. Make suggestions casually and dispassionately, so it's not obvious that you're deliberately pushing your ideas. Additionally, react enthusiastically when someone considers doing something you want them to do to implicitly reinforce those ideas. Extreme ownership inspires ownership in others. We've established that extreme ownership empowers you to pinpoint your and your team's flaws and do everything in your power to improve. The other main benefit of extreme ownership is that practicing it inspires your team to practice extreme ownership, too. Willink and Babin assert that even if you lead perfectly, taking extreme ownership of every mistake your team makes, you likely won't be able to accomplish the team's mission on your own. For the greatest chance of success, you need every member of your team to be as motivated and egoless as you. In other words, every member of your team should take extreme ownership. To accomplish this, lead by example. Your leadership style establishes your team's culture. If you practice extreme ownership, taking responsibility for everyone's mistakes and doing everything in your power to further the mission, the rest of your team will want to do the same. Inspiring extreme ownership is more important than practicing it. While, as the authors note, practicing extreme ownership as a leader helps your team improve in the short term, research shows that inspiring a culture of extreme ownership among your team matters most for long-term success. In Built to Last, Jim Collins and Jerry I. Porras confirmed this idea through a 6-year study of 18 superstar companies that lasted longer and found more success than any of their competitors. Collins and Porras state that most people associate successful leadership with charisma, persistence, and genius day-to-day oversight. However, according to their research, none of these things are unique to the world's best leaders. Many charismatic, persistent, business-savvy leaders build companies that fail. The one quality that sets apart leaders who build organizations that last is long-term vision with an eye on organizational culture. This means that no matter how good of a leader you are, your organization will fail if you don't inspire extreme ownership in others. If you want to build a lasting organizational culture, leading by example will only take you so far. Collins and Porras argue that ultimately, you want your team to feel allegiance to the values of your culture, not you as a leader. To achieve this, they advise strictly requiring your team to embody your core organizational values, in our case, extreme ownership, and firing anyone who doesn't fit the culture. Inspiring your team to take extreme ownership benefits you in a number of ways. Your team members perform better in their individual roles, you have more time to focus on big-picture leadership tasks, and your team is more likely to collaborate effectively. Let's explore each benefit in detail. When your team takes ownership, they master their individual roles. When everyone on your team takes extreme ownership, it doesn't mean they'll try to control everything. Rather, team members who take extreme ownership make it their first priority to work as hard as they can in their individual roles. Why do employees taking extreme ownership perform their tasks well? Willink and Babin argue that ideally, you'll place every member of your team in a role that best suits their skills and allows them to contribute the most to the mission. If your team members clearly see how they fit into the broader mission plan, they'll realize that the best way they can take extreme ownership is to fulfill the responsibilities you've assigned them, and will feel motivated to do so. Another benefit of having team members take extreme ownership is that they won't just sit passively and wait for orders. They'll go above and beyond their individual roles. Because teammates taking extreme ownership understand the mission and how they contribute to it, they can recognize ways to improve the team that you're too busy or distant to think of. By empowering your team members to take action and make decisions on their own, you ensure that every part of your organization is constantly improving itself. In complex environments, your team needs to take extreme ownership. Willink and Babin advocate for a team in which every member takes ownership of the mission and gladly fulfills the responsibilities you've assigned them, but also goes above and beyond instead of just following orders. In Team of Teams, former U.S. Army General Stanley McChrystal explains why this shared ownership is so necessary and goes into further detail on the advantages of this kind of team. McChrystal argues that most of our traditional beliefs about management originate in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, when the factory assembly line was first invented. Business leaders came to assume that the best practice was to manage people like machines, giving them simple tasks to accomplish with a focus on efficiency above all else. However, most leaders don't realize that these principles fail to function in systems that are more complex than an assembly line. Assembly line managers can effectively hand down orders to far larger teams than, say, the commanding officer of a military unit because assembly line tasks are far simpler than the problems a military unit has to face. In contrast, in situations where you don't know exactly what to do, teams that do nothing but follow orders fail. For example, in the unpredictable environment of war, if troops blindly follow commands from above, they may face disaster if the enemy can predict and counter their strategy. During his time at war, McChrystal discovered that lower-level team members could make better decisions than their bosses if they were given the power to make those decisions and take ownership. Business, too, is a complex, unpredictable environment. Instead of trying to personally run your entire team and restrict them to their assigned responsibilities, you need to empower them to make their own decisions if you want them to adapt to unforeseen setbacks. When your team takes ownership, your job is easier. Willink and Babin argue that when your team takes extreme ownership and you trust them to perform well in their individual roles, it frees you to focus your time and attention on big-picture leadership tasks. As a leader, it's your job to make sure every one of your team's tasks aligns with the broader mission. Other team members will be too closely involved in specific tasks to see for certain whether or not they're successfully contributing to the mission's progress, so it's important that you have time to do this. Short-form note: to decide what important big-picture tasks to focus on once you can trust your people to handle their roles, Gary Keller, The One Thing, suggests identifying one task that will make all future tasks easier. For example, imagine you're the director of a non-profit with the goal of ending world hunger. Once you've freed up your time by delegating the day-to-day activity of your basic aid program to a team, you ask yourself, what can I do next that will make all future tasks easier? You decide to design a fundraising campaign that will make it easier for you to expand the organization, indirectly accomplishing much more than if you were to volunteer to distribute food yourself. When your team takes ownership, they collaborate better. According to Willink and Babin, your team members also need to take extreme ownership to collaborate effectively. When they lack extreme ownership, team members prioritize their ego over the mission's success. Instead of doing everything they can to increase the team's chance of victory, each team member only cares about doing their own job well. When other teammates are struggling, they blame them for failing instead of offering to help. In some cases, they may even compete against each other, hindering other team members to make themselves look better. In contrast, when your team takes extreme ownership, they prioritize the team's success over their own. Instead of celebrating when a teammate fails, they do everything they can to help that teammate avoid failure in the future. Willink and Babin argue that this kind of collaboration is invaluable. Mutual support is often the only way to succeed. In life, pivot from competing to collaborating. In The Courage to be Disliked, Ichiro Kishimi and Fumite Koga explore this same dichotomy between competition and collaboration, and they explain why you would choose one or the other, not just at work, but in life. Those who pursue competition do so because they base their self-worth on approval from others. They only strive for success because it makes them happy when someone recognizes that they're better than someone else, and thus, they blame and hinder those they see as competitors. Other people pursue collaboration because they base their self-worth on the good that they do. They feel happy when they can make the world better by helping others, and they recognize that collaboration is the most effective way to do so. According to Kishimi and Koga, these root motives don't just predict how you work with others. They also shape how you approach everything in life, for instance, hobbies, friendships, and romantic relationships, and determine your overall life happiness. You can either see other people as competitors or allies, and you won't be happy if you choose the former. It's exhausting and unfulfilling to constantly try to prove that you're better than others. Collaboration across the hierarchy. Extreme ownership is especially important in regard to collaboration between a leader and their subordinates. Leaders and subordinates should feel comfortable asking each other for anything they need to do their jobs, but Willink and Babin identify two collaborative goals that are especially important. First, bosses need the necessary information to give effective orders. The leaders giving orders often only have a high-level view of their team's operations, lacking specific information and expertise that lower-level teammates have from doing their jobs. Thus, instead of assuming they know best, leaders should actively seek out the opinions of those responsible for executing their orders. Likewise, subordinates have the responsibility to keep bosses informed of all relevant information and to push back whenever leaders make poor decisions based on incomplete information. Short-form note. In The Effective Executive, Peter F. Drucker goes one step further than Willink and Babin in his advice. Not only should bosses seek out the opinions of others before making a decision, but they should also require disagreement and conflict before making any significant decisions. By default, subordinates avoid challenging their boss's judgment because they have an incentive to get on their boss's good side. But if the boss mandates productive disagreement, the only way subordinates can please the boss is by fulfilling their responsibility to voice any opinion that may improve the final decision. Second, the authors state, subordinates need to understand the rationale behind decisions and commands. It's a leader's job to continually explain the big-picture plan to their subordinates, especially detailing their individual roles in achieving that plan. If your team members don't understand exactly how their job contributes to the mission, they won't feel like their work matters, they'll lack the motivation to perform, and they won't take extreme ownership. For this reason, if, as a subordinate, you don't understand why your boss is telling you to do something, it's your responsibility to get clarity from them as to how you fit into the overall plan. A clear mission inspires mutual trust. In Start With Why, Simon Sinek provides additional details on why team members must understand how they fit into the mission before they can take extreme ownership. Sinek asserts that when leaders clarify a selfless mission and purpose to the team, their subordinates recognize the values they share with their leaders and teammates. These shared values form the basis of organizational culture, making everyone feel like they belong to the same community pursuing the same selfless, purposeful, and meaningful mission. In turn, feelings of community enable mutual trust. Team members believe that their teammates will support them emotionally and help them reach their goals. Sinek explains that mutual trust directly leads to extreme ownership throughout an organization. Without mutual trust, team members feel like they need to protect themselves. They exclusively act in their self-interest because they feel it's the only way to be safe. However, once they trust each other, team members feel secure enough to put the mission over their own desires, taking extreme ownership. Compared to Willink and Babin, Sinek downplays subordinates' ability to inspire themselves. Willink and Babin claim that followers should seek out a motivating purpose by clarifying their boss's instructions, but Sinek would likely argue that if the organization isn't already centered around a greater purpose that enables feelings of community, subordinates will find it difficult to motivate themselves no matter how they're contributing. Extreme ownership in action. So far, we've explained what it means to take extreme ownership and why it's important for any leader to practice. It empowers you to continuously improve your team and inspires extreme ownership in other team members. In our final section, we'll discuss some of Willink and Babin's general leadership tips. 4 rules that leaders taking extreme ownership must follow for the greatest chance of victory. Rule number 1. Be transparent with your plans and keep them simple. We've established that before team members can take extreme ownership, they need to clearly understand how their tasks contribute to the mission. Willink and Babin offer 2 ways to ensure your team fully understands any plan you make. Be consistently transparent with your plans, and keep them as simple as possible. Be transparent with your plans. Willink and Babin present a step-by-step planning process that emphasizes transparency at every stage. First, seek input from lower-level teammates when you're initially devising a plan. Not only will these teammates understand the plan and the thought process behind it, but if you accept their ideas, they'll be more likely to take ownership of it. Next, after you've outlined a plan, conduct a briefing in which you explain it to everyone involved in executing it. During the briefing, encourage team members to ask questions and voice their opinions, putting any doubts they have about the plan to rest. Finally, after you've executed the plan, hold a debriefing to get everyone on the same page about what worked and what didn't. When you're transparent about any and all errors made, your team understands how to improve. Involve the team, but make the decisions yourself. The authors of $1 Trillion Coach offer a caveat to Willink and Babin's transparent planning process outlined above. Giving your team agency doesn't mean turning it into a democracy. Every stage of Willink and Babin's planning process involves both informing the team and encouraging them to share their perspectives. However, according to $1 Trillion Coach, you should make it clear that the final decision rests with you. Often, your team members' opinions will shape your decision, but in cases where they can't reach consensus, you'll have to override them and make the choice you believe to be right. This applies even after the decision-making stage. During your debrief, if the team can't agree on what went wrong and how to do better next time, it's up to you to decide how they will work to improve. According to $1 Trillion Coach, if you've chosen a good team, they should wholeheartedly commit to whatever you end up deciding. As long as your team believes that you fully considered their opinions, they will likely still feel ownership of the decision you ultimately make. Keep your plans simple. Willink and Babin's second way to ensure your team understands your plans is to keep the plans as simple as possible. At a certain point, added complexity hits a point of diminishing returns. If your team doesn't quickly grasp the plan, it's probably more complex than it's worth. Keeping your plan simple has other benefits, too. Simple plans are easier to adapt on the fly, and they force you to focus on the most important aspects of your mission. To illustrate, imagine you're a grocery store manager. To keep your employees from wasting time, you create a complicated flowchart describing exactly what they should be doing in any given situation. This flowchart is likely to confuse your workers, and it may prevent them from responding to a situation you didn't anticipate. For example, if someone starts shoplifting. The simpler and more effective solution would be to lay down a rule that keeps your workers focused on what really matters. Something like, improve the customer experience at all times. Short-form note, another benefit of simple plans is that they're less intimidating. For this reason, simplifying your plans may motivate you and others to follow through on them. For instance, in I Will Teach You to Be Rich, Ramit Sethi explains that many people see retirement saving and investing as something complicated that they don't want to mess up, so they ignore the issue completely. To solve this problem, he created a financial system simple enough for anyone to get started, and getting started is good enough. Since investments compound over time, getting started early is beneficial no matter how you do it, even if the returns aren't as robust as a more complex system would give. Rule number 2. Always focus on the most important task. Next, Willink and Babin offer a piece of advice that applies equally to teams and individuals. At all times, identify the most important task and focus all your attention on getting it done. If you try to handle multiple problems at once, you run the risk of spreading yourself too thin and failing to solve any of them. Or worse, you may start to panic and fail to even try to solve them. This is especially true when things don't go according to plan. If something unexpected arises, you and your team need to be flexible enough to immediately refocus on the new most important task. To prepare for situations like this, Willink and Babin recommend predicting what could go wrong and preparing your team for a potential change of plans. The difficult part of changing plans is quickly communicating new priorities to everyone on your team, but if you prepare them with contingency plans ahead of time, your team can adapt much more quickly and may not even need your direct instructions. For example, hospitals have protocols in place in case the power goes out during surgery. Protocols that involve tackling the most important tasks one at a time. Everyone in the operating room knows that first, they need to find an alternative source of light. Then, ensure the patient's blood oxygen is stable, and so on. Balance your life by focusing on the most important task. The skill of prioritizing and focusing on the most important task is not only valuable at work but also as a means for life fulfillment. Willink and Babin note that when you're trying to do too many things at once, you feel overwhelmed and fail to accomplish any of them. Similarly, in high-performance habits, Brandon Burchard asserts that trying to simultaneously improve every area of life, your career, social life, mental health, and so on, instead of prioritizing what's most important leads to an unbalanced life in which you fail to be happy with any area. To create a balanced life, Burchard advises taking time once a week to chart your satisfaction with 10 different categories of life, including work, family, and well-being, among others. Set goals in each of these categories and focus on the one that will boost your life satisfaction the most. Regularly reviewing your various levels of life satisfaction helps you reprioritize in shifting circumstances and refocus on the new most important area of your life at all times. For example, imagine someone who spends too much time at work at the expense of their health and is consequently miserable. They stop and reflect, realizing that improving their health by exercising every day is more important to them than spending a little more time at work. By focusing on this important task, they regain life balance. Additionally, you might apply Willink and Babin's advice to this practice and create contingency plans in advance so you can reprioritize more quickly after unexpected life events. If the person in our example anticipates that, more than anything else, losing their job would cause their overall life satisfaction to plummet, they could come up with a backup plan for this scenario. For instance, to start their own company. Rule number 3. Make decisions before you're certain they're right. Even if you've made contingency plans and prepared for unexpected obstacles, you'll face situations where you don't know what to do. Willink and Babin assert that you must become comfortable making decisions in uncertain conditions. In some cases, you won't have enough information to know if the decision you want to make will hurt your team or help them. When this happens, many leaders' first instinct is to wait and gather more information. However, inaction is almost always the wrong decision. By doing nothing, you're sacrificing the positive influence your expertise will have on the situation. You'll never be able to know everything, so make the most logical decision you can with your current knowledge and move on. In other situations, there won't even be a chance for you to do something good. Often, you'll have to choose between a set of equally painful alternatives. In these cases, too, it's vital to act sooner rather than later and try to pick the lesser evil. If nothing else, making decisions that are painful but necessary will earn your team's respect. They'll see that you can perform wisely under pressure. When overthinking leads to worse decisions. In Algorithms to Live By, Tom Griffiths and Brian Christian take Willink and Babin's argument further. Not only does waiting for more information waste time that you could use to take action, but sometimes, the more information you gather, the worse your decisions get. Most of the time, the first factors you consider when making your decision are the ones with the greatest impact on the outcome. If you wait for additional, relatively irrelevant information, you might put too much emphasis on these details and second-guess yourself when you shouldn't. According to Griffiths and Christian, contrary to what you may expect, even computers sometimes make decisions before they have all the necessary information. Scientists running tests or simulations on powerful computers often trade off accuracy for speed. This highlights another benefit of uncertain decision-making that Willink and Babin imply, but don't explicitly state. Making a decision sooner rather than later lets you immediately refocus your attention somewhere more useful. If you're in a no-win situation, making a decisive call sooner rather than later will allow you to shift your efforts and recover more quickly from the fallout. Rule number 4. Be wary of extremes. Willink and Babin argue that any trait of an effective leader becomes detrimental in excess. This is at the root of most persistent leadership problems. When in doubt, question whether you've drifted too far toward an extreme. The way forward may be to employ less of a good thing. The primary example Willink and Babin used to demonstrate this concept is the need to balance discipline and flexibility. If your primary goal is freedom, the ability to do whatever you want, a certain amount of discipline is necessary. However, at a certain point, too much discipline limits your freedom by trapping you in rigid habits. For instance, you can't enjoy a nice vacation unless you discipline yourself to save up the money to take it. But if you're too disciplined and compulsively work 80-hour weeks, saving every cent you earn, you'll never take that vacation. It's possible for teams to be too disciplined, as well. Rehearsing discipline procedures too intensely discourages team members from staying flexible in unfamiliar situations when they need to improvise. Promote conflicting ideals. In Range, David Epstein further defines the problem of too much discipline and offers a solution that Willink and Babin do not. He explains that the problem occurs when a tool, such as discipline, becomes so intrinsic to an organization's culture that they feel as if they can't operate without it. Epstein uses the real-world example of wilderness firefighters who discipline themselves to never part from their tools, then fail to outrun an advancing fire, perishing instead of dropping their heavy packs. The counterintuitive solution is for leaders to send their team mixed messages, to build your organization's culture around conflicting ideals. It's impossible for your team to embody perfect discipline and perfect flexibility, but instructing your team to try gives the greatest chance for them to make prudent decisions that take multiple ideals into account. Epstein applies this logic to every value that a leader needs to balance. In a sense, this is what Willink and Babin are also doing when they advocate the balance between extremes. Epstein's team-centric advice applies equally to individuals. By striving to embody conflicting virtues, you reduce the chance that you'll commit too far in any one direction. For instance, if, when raising a child, you try to be both the most nurturing parent and the most demanding parent at the same time, you may end up maintaining a healthy balance between the two.